Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Alors, vous avez une belle chemise ukrainienne. Ça trahit vos origines puisque vous êtes né en Ukraine.
Oui.
Vous êtes journaliste. Vous êtes en même temps responsable d'une ONG, comme on dit en français. Vous faites un peu le tour du monde des rédactions pour parler de votre pays, de l'Ukraine, et de ses difficultés qu'elle subit aujourd'hui. Première question, mais pour vous présenter vous, qu'est-ce qui a fait que vous ayez eu envie de faire ce tour du monde pour aller à la rencontre des rédactions du monde entier pour parler de votre pays?
Well, indeed, I was, for the entirety of the war until last September, I was based in Kiev. Unlike many of my colleagues, men from the ages of 20 to 61 who are not able to leave Ukraine, I'm lucky I have a dual citizenship. I'm a US and a Ukrainian citizen, so I was able to travel. I was traveling to Davos and Munich Security Conference, so I was lucky. But after 3 years of sitting in Ukraine and broadcasting and talking about the war, as the bombs were literally flying and our building where our TV station is based, 26th floor, was literally shaking. That's just the reality of life in Ukraine. I felt like I needed to do something else. I frankly felt burnt out, tired of the same thing. And so I decided to go to distant countries, the so-called global south. I don't like this term, but it's probably better than tiers monde, right? The third world that used to be called. But basically distant places that normally don't come into contact with Ukraine and vice versa. To talk about this war, to share my story of the war, of the daily life in Ukraine, why I think this is a generational conflict, why its effects will reverberate and have a domino effect for generations to come. And it's still not settled. You know, it's still in the balance. If Ukraine falls, we will be talking about a different world that will affect all of us, this situation. But it's also a listening tour. It's not just me telling people what to think, and but it's for me to listen to how people in these distant places, and I started in South Pacific. I went to Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, Australia, New Zealand, how they perceive this conflict, who do they support, how it has affected their lives. After the South Pacific, I went to Johannesburg, South Africa, and for 6 months I was traveling through 20 African countries. No planes, just buses, trains, wherever they are, cars, slow travel, crossing borders by land, going to small towns, going to the capital, speaking on state TV, speaking to gatherings of elders, taxi drivers, just a huge amount of communication. I've been able to appear on 35 different African TV channels, more than 60 radio programs, and dozens of newspapers. And in a way, this was a first. Someone like, for example, Burundi, a country that no Ukrainian has ever visited, from what I understand, in this capacity. And a country where Ukraine does not have an embassy. Why I'm doing this as a sort of ambassador at large is because Ukraine does not have the capacity to fill this role. We don't have embassies in most of these countries. We don't have an embassy in Malawi, no embassy in Zambia, and these are big countries. No embassy in Namibia, no embassy in Tanzania, for example. Russian Federation has embassies in 48 out of 54 African countries. This is just to give you an example. So Ukraine is playing catch up. It's now compensating for decades of being absent from the politics of the African continent. Now that Ukraine needs the support of the so-global South, we have activated our work. Ukraine opened 10 new embassies in Africa after the war started. And so this is to complement those efforts. I am not traveling as part of the Ukrainian government. I don't receive a cent from the Ukrainian government. This is largely life savings. I'm using largely my own funds, and this is my private initiative.
Beaucoup des pays que vous avez cités, la Russie y est très présente et effectue un travail diplomatique très important et qui, même en finançant ces pays africains. Quel accueil vous y rencontrez et comment est-ce que vous êtes perçu là-bas? Est-ce que vous n'avez pas ressenti que ces pays, maintenant, beaucoup ont basculé et sont devenus pro-russes?
Well, indeed, Africa especially. Africa is fertile ground for Russia's propaganda efforts. It's been written about in some of the countries with free press like South Africa and Kenya. Kenya has devoted, many Kenyan newspapers have recently,
Madagascar aussi,
Madagascar addressed the issue of Russian involvement in political processes. Madagascar, 2018, the elections, and the Wagner Group involved itself on both sides of the election. When I was in Madagascar 2 weeks ago, and journalists told me, like, Peter, we had 50 registered parties in these elections, and they told me behind every party there was a Russian operative. They support everyone. It doesn't matter. They will come out the winner because an investment is made, and then they will get it back in resources. Central African Republic, Niger, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Sudan, Chad, wherever Russia has involved recently, especially Francophone Africa. That's a big problem. And when I was coming to Africa, of course, there were concerns of safety and all of these things. Thank God they haven't materialized. I felt safe everywhere I've gone, and I received much better reception than I thought. Once again, it's evidenced by my ability to present my case on state TV. I was on state TV in TV Mozambique, which is very difficult to do. Mozambique is a pro-Russian country. Not like Zimbabwe or Burundi, but it is. But somehow I was able to present my case. And so the reception has been much, much better than I expected. But, your answer, your question is actually correct. Some countries like Burundi, the president of Burundi, General Ndayishimiye, has openly expressed support for Russia. Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe has openly supported Russia. So in those countries, you will see sometimes the images of Putin on buses, public buses. Putin, Ndayishimiye, and Traoré, the strongman in Burkina Faso, also supported by the Russian Federation and the Wagner mercenaries. You have Putin and Gaddafi. So there is this cult of strongman that is being kind of imposed by the Russians in Africa, or at least assisted, right? This is sort of the idea that in the climate of endemic and hopeless corruption, the only hope is for a strong man. Traoré, Gaddafi, Putin. So there's a sort of hierarchy, a sort of altar. And I've seen a lot of Africans who admire that. But I still believe that a lot of these efforts are not genuine. They're not organic. A lot of what you see, this imagery on buses, etc. Or there's a graffiti wall in Johannesburg that I saw with ANC leaders, Mandela, and Putin together. I believe that the Russians may be behind this. They're sponsoring these little things to make it look like just an outpouring of public, popular, love and enthusiasm about Vladimir Putin. I do not believe that all of these efforts are organic. I don't believe that all of them come from the people. The Russians are working very cleverly. They have a lot of money to spend to make it look like Africa supports Russia. I disagree with that. Even if you have governmental dealings with Russia, when I was in Namibia a week before my visit, and Namibia signed a nuclear power agreement with Russia. And of course, when I talk to the journalists, I say it's your sovereign right to make whichever treaties and to be friends with whoever. And then I tell them about the great narrative that I'm here to grapple with, to discuss. The narrative that Russia is fighting these neo-colonialist forces and helping Africa regain their independence again from the Brits, from the French, just like the Soviet Union helped Africa in 1962 in fighting apartheid. And so they're saying, help us. We are for democratization of international relations. The Ukrainians have a counter-argument. They're saying they're disguising their imperialists with this rhetoric. They're disguising their own imperialist and neo-colonial war against Ukraine, which they want to bring back as a former colony. And I think that argument can be very effective in Africa. I've also used an analogy when they say, well, you're very related people, Ukrainians and Russians, you're brothers, right? Well, that's exactly the rhetoric Putin used. In fact, Putin said there's no difference between Ukrainians and Russians. It's the same people. And I say, okay, it's like, example, South Africa. The Zulus decided that we have this country called Lesotho, and the people are Basotho. Basotho, Setswana, we have Zulu. They're all related Bantu peoples. Why? We should just be one Zulu nation. I think Lesotho people would disagree with that. They have their own identity, even though they may be related. So that's another argument I've used about the historicity of Putin's arguments, that just because Ukrainians and Russians come from the same history, their Eastern Orthodox religion, it does not mean that Ukrainians do not have their own identity.
Question annexe, je dirais, mais beaucoup de ces pays ne sont pas très sûrs. La vie d'un homme n'y a pas beaucoup d'importance. Quand vous y allez, vous n'avez pas peur, vous-même, un jour, d'être assassiné?
Maybe I'm reckless, or just maybe I should have more fear than I do. Maybe I should exercise more caution, because there have been stories, horrible stories. Before the war started, Central African Republic, of Wagner mercenaries killed their own Russian journalists. You may have heard this story. A group of 3 or 4 journalists were murdered by their own compatriots who were mercenaries protecting the government of Central African Republic. So, and before I came, my friends of friends, 2 journalists from Czech Republic with a very small YouTube channel were asking people about politics around, like Vox Populi, around the city of Harare in Zimbabwe. They were apprehended. They were put in jail for 2 weeks, and then they were deported. They were very lucky. They were just deported. So there is that, concern, because if you come as an officially registered journalist on a journalist visa, you cannot come. I mean, you will not get that visa ever. So you have to be very careful. You don't go around asking people questions, and especially not about internal politics. So even in Zimbabwe, I did not reach the level of state TV. But I was able to, I got on the pages of a government newspaper, for example, one of the oldest, published in Bulawayo. I mean, Africa is a surprising continent. So there are hits and misses, there are security concerns. And yet, once again, I did not feel for a single moment unsafe in Africa. Of course, I mean, I feel much less safe in Ukraine. Even before the war, you could run into just simple banditry, right, in Ukraine. France, I'm sorry, but some of the European cities, Genève, Paris, in some places are very unsafe. Africa feels much safer than any of the European cities these days. Sorry to say that.
En visitant tous ces pays, vous avez sans doute croisé des Ukrainiens de votre âge qui ont fui l'Ukraine pour ne pas faire la guerre. Or, on sait qu'un des principaux problèmes de l'Ukraine aujourd'hui est le manque d'hommes pour aller faire la guerre. Est-ce que ça vous met pas en colère de voir ces gens qui fuient leur pays pour éviter de faire la guerre?
This is a very important, and it's a question that hurts. It's a painful question, because the math, the arithmetic, is decisively against Ukraine. Putin has shown that he has enough people and he's got enough money to pay for cannon fodder. People he just puts and uses as just meat in the grinder of this war. And some of these people have never seen the kind of money that Russia is willing to pay to sign the initial contract to go into the army, up to $27,000. For some of these Russians in Siberia, it's an untold amount of money, and they're interested. And so the question is when Russia will run out of these men. Russia needs more men because it's on the attack. The attacking side loses more men. It needs more men. So there's a little bit of that compensation. But still, Ukraine is running out of able-bodied men to fight in this war. I just had a friend who was snatched off the street by the recruiters. He is in his late 40s. When you're 48 years old, I don't think you can be a good soldier, especially if you've never fired a gun. I mean, even after 30, you cannot be part of a storm brigade. It has to be under 30. Ukraine, it has the oldest, demographically oldest army fighting right now. So, and recently, Zelensky has had to yield to the demands of his electorates, the mothers and fathers, to let the men from 18 to 21 leave the country. They were banned from leaving. Now they are. And some of these men now, of course, they started leaving. Poland has seen an uptick in the number of men there. I can guarantee you that probably over 50% of them will not return, even after the war is over. They're putting down roots. They're finding jobs. they're going to be settling down, having children. That is, apart from that, there's a big issue of the demographics. 5 to 6 million of Ukrainians remain outside of Ukraine. And that means women of childbearing age, women who are giving birth to children outside of Ukraine, who do not have anything in common with Ukraine anymore. So that's going to be a huge issue even after the war is over and Ukraine still is able to maintain its identity, its sovereignty. But when it comes to the fighting men, once again, the equation is very lopsided in favor of Russia. Russia not only is able to send more men into this war, but it's been able to recruit North Korean soldiers. They've been found some Chinese now nationals in the army, and actually Africans. You know, there's been stories about Africans not just fighting in Russian army, but actually working in some of these drone producing plants, Yelabuga in Tatarstan. I visited Zambia. I visited Zimbabwe, and journalists there told me that they actually were sent by their media houses to Russia to investigate these stories about African women working in these plants, producing weapons, producing drones. And that's where I see the disbalance. Russia can rely on its authoritarian partners to get more manpower. We in Ukraine, we do not have that luxury. Europeans and Americans do not have any appetite to send their men to fight in Ukraine. The only formula we hear from the French and the British is that peacekeepers, yes, tens of thousands, but only after the war is over. But the question is, will Ukraine be able to stay in this fight when the math is so much against it? Because still, yes, it's a drone war, we say, but we need men to operate these drones. It's still a matter of numbers. We still rely on men to do the fighting.
Quelle est la situation en Ukraine aujourd'hui?
The situation is, of course, it's gotten harder. The attacks are more vicious. Putin is able to launch up to 800 drones per attack, per night. So that means civilians in Kiev, city of 4 million people, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Odessa, spend up to 10 hours per night spending, in a bomb shelter or in a subway. That means sleep deprivation. That means psychiatric problems multiplied by millions. There's a whole country as hostage to this crazy man's fixation on Ukraine. He's terrorizing our civilians. This is not a war against military. Putin is throwing everything, and he's trying to create a situation, make life impossible for Ukrainians, where they capitulate to him, where they demand Zelensky, make whatever peace at whatever cost with Putin. That's Putin's, calculation. Of course, more Ukrainians now than ever before believe that Ukraine will not be able to get back Crimea and the Donbass. There's a realization that it's not going to be possible in the near future. More people are for peace, but I don't think that Ukrainians are still willing to reach peace by capitulation, because they know that if they give in to Putin's demands, Ukraine will disappear as a sovereign state. Putin is not fighting for just some piece of territory. He's fighting for the whole Ukraine. But having said that, it's also not very helpful to Ukrainians when it comes to their fighting spirit, to the morale, when you have such mixed messaging coming from Washington, that transatlantic unity is eroding, when the whole group of European leaders have to accompany Zelensky to the Oval Office because they are afraid that the American president is giving too much to Putin and not getting anything in return. This is very discouraging to our soldiers and to our civilians to see this kind of disarray and chaos in Western capitals.
Sur le terrain, au cours des derniers mois, on était assez inquiets, pessimistes, parce que les Russes progressaient très peu, mais régulièrement, ils grignotaient. Et là, depuis quelques jours, on a des bonnes nouvelles parce qu'on apprend qu'il y a des contre-offensives ukrainiennes et que vous avez repris quelques villages. Est-ce que ça vous rend plus optimiste pour l'avenir?
I mean, there's good news and bad news here. Of course, you have to start with the idea that, I take part in panels on different TV channels, and there are Russian or panelists who are sympathetic to Russia. In Arab channels, China Global television network, and they always say, well, Russia is definitely winning on the battlefield. It's conquering villages. First of all, let me say, at the pace that they're doing it, it will take them several years to reach Kiev, and they will lose another million men dead and wounded. So it's a question of how many victims can Putin sustain, right? He plays a good game. He's a KGB man. He's like, we can throw another 300,000. That's what he's broadcasting, but we really don't know where that critical line is for the Kremlin. That's sort of this time X. We don't know what is the limit. Putin is also hoping for a collapse, a sudden, in war, it's not just linear progression. It could be one soldier turns around and it leads to a panic and the front collapses. That happens. And Putin is, as a man obsessed, like Hitler in his bunker in 1945. He believed in the victory of Third Reich until the last moment, when Goebbels was shooting himself in the head and his family. Hitler was the believer. So Putin will remain that believer till the last moment. And also, let me just say that, remember when Putin went into Ukraine and when he announced that war on February 24, 2022, he expected, by all accounts, the Ukrainians to fall within 3 to 7 business days. He'd walk into Kiev within a week, be greeted with flowers as the liberator. And 3.5 years later, we're still here. Just think about it, 3 days versus 3.5 years. So if Ukrainians are enabled to continue to resist, if we get the kind of weaponry we need, if Europeans are able to create this joint production of drones with Ukraine, and that's already being discussed, the Germans are helping, the French are helping, etc., then I think Ukraine can stay in this game. But with this, once again, this vacillation and hesitancy that we see in Europe, with the ascension of right-wing populist parties, Alternative für Deutschland, and others, I don't have to name the name, but the French politics have also known its share of right-wing populism lately. And right-wing populism always happens to be on the side of Putin, with one notable exception, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who's a big friend of Ukraine. So it's not so cut and dried, but that's exactly what Putin is counting on. That on the one hand, he's got this authoritarian monolith, Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. On the other hand, he's got this fractious politics of Europe, and he feels that he will divide and conquer. He's got his allies, Orban, Fico, he's got Alternative for Deutschland, and all these right-wing or left-wing, extreme left-wing parties. He feels that sooner or later they will buckle, they will give up on Ukraine, and he'll be able to walk into Kiev.
Comment est-ce que vous voyez l'avenir de l'Ukraine à moyen terme, je dirais?
Very tough, but once again, 3.5 years, Ukraine is still there. Economically, there's actually, paradoxically, it's a miracle. There's been an uptick, and I know, because we started from a very low point of 2022, everything went down. So there's been a little bit of a improvement in the economy. Of course, all of that thanks to the European Union, and 0% loans. And this economic support, without it, Ukraine would not have been able to survive. That's very clear. If that holds, I think Ukraine can continue to stay in the game. One important initiative, and I will finish with that, is something that's being debated, as you know, in European capitals, what to do with the sovereign wealth fund, the frozen assets of the Russian Federation. $300 billion plus that was frozen at the beginning of the war. There's some resistance to that, but recently, U.S. senators, including Lindsey Graham, have actually decided to support the idea of not just using the interest on this to help Ukraine, but actually confiscate the assets. It's a controversial issue. There's pros and cons, and there's some argument that it will hurt European banking system tremendously. On the other hand, some Lawrence Tribe and other Harvard professors wrote a 100-page report saying that it's justified. If we're talking about how it breaks with international norms, well, Putin broke with the norm by invading a sovereign country, right? So it's justified as a sui generis situation. You should do it. I think there's a momentum for that. The French, the Brits, and the Germans, are sitting on the fence. They're not sure about it, but I think sooner or later a decision will have to be made. It's the only just decision that using Russian money, Russia's own money, to help Ukraine resist the aggression. I hope it happens sooner rather than later.
Pour quelles raisons? Expliquez aux Français, aux Européens, mais aux Français en particulier, Pour quelles raisons c'est aussi important pour l'Europe, pour la France, de soutenir l'Ukraine?
It's very important for very pragmatic reasons. Imagine Ukraine falls now. How many more millions refugees will spill over Europe's borders? They will not be running to Syria, and most of them will not be running to Russia. Some, but not all. You're talking about 10 more million Ukrainians, maybe a million in France. Imagine the sort of pressure it will create for politicians there. This influx of refugees leads to radicalization of politics, as we've seen. Europeans understand that very well, that maybe we should just give Ukraine enough money, support Ukraine to where Ukrainians actually are able to stay there and not come to us, because it's a serious blow to European economies, at least for a while. Eventually, well-educated refugees such as Ukrainians benefit the local economies, including in Poland. Ukrainians have benefited Poland tremendously, but then you have this phenomenon of Nawrocki, right-wing politician who actually came to power with using some anti-Ukrainian rhetoric. Because every time you have a million people coming, they create disruption. They create, they present a challenge. The Ukrainian women present a challenge to Polish women, right? They become these eligible women. All of a sudden, you have hundreds of thousands of women coming from another country, competing for the men. I mean, it's actually as simple as that. And another thing is they know, President Macron knows it. He's actually taking the lead on this, at least rhetorically. I think France has led, especially recently, when it comes to the rhetoric about the need to support Ukraine and to increase its own defense, right, industry, especially with everything that's happening in Washington and all the rhetoric coming out of that. They know that if Ukraine falls, next up there will be Moldova, the Baltic states. We saw how Putin now is probing NATO's defense, Chapter 5, right, of NATO's charter, by launching 20 drones into Poland shortly after violating Romanian airspace. It's already happening, folks. Let's wake up. The war is happening. It's just it's a hybrid war. We will not see Russian tanks spilling over to Polish border and then going to Germany. It's not going to happen. This war is being prosecuted by other means, and it's already happening. And if Ukraine falls, it will intensify, and everything it will present clear and present danger to European liberal democratic project.
Merci.
Thank you.